Ahora sí, estamos en vivo. Tenemos colección lente que todo marcha sobre ruedas. Eh, bueno, me presento, Edgar. Eh, pues quiero hacer este tipo de videos. Voy a hacer videos de muchas cosas, la verdad. Siento que últimamente pienso la mejor manera o cómo ejercitar el músculo artístico, ¿no? Que todos tenemos dentro, desde que queremos ser DJs a fotógrafos, cualquier cosa que se te pueda ocurrir. Em, entonces, tengo ganas de hacer como videos. Hay muchas cosas que creo que me gustaría compartir. Y bueno, en este caso, esta es una de ellas. A mí me gusta mucho ver cómo, bueno, estudiar y me gusta estar como en grupos de estudio, que son como los work session estudio, y te metes y como que puedes ver a gente estudiando y todo. Pero para empezar, siento que hoy en día es como un poco difícil encontrar ese tipo de lugares. Y en segunda, a veces me distraigo mucho viendo cómo a las personas. Entonces creo que una mecánica o algo chido que podemos hacer aquí es de que pues si empieza a entrar gente, cuando estemos estudiando, podemos, no sé, trabajar 50 minutos a full y luego 10 minutos platicar y ver un video o hacer algo, ¿no? Entre nosotros. Pero esos 50 minutos utilizarlos para que, pues, tanto yo como ustedes, pues, prioricen sus metas, ¿no? Y esas metas pueden ser desde, pues, estudiar para un examen hasta cualquier tipo de cosas, ¿no? Que, pues, que cada uno de ustedes se vaya planteando de forma individual. Yo estoy haciendo específicamente esto porque me gustaría entrar a una maestría. Eh, Me gustaría estar en una maestría en Japón y pues si no consigo eso, al menos me gustaría tener el conocimiento necesario para trabajar en el área que a mí me gusta. Eh, la maestría que me gustaría hacer es en ciencias computacionales. Es bastante diferente a la carrera que yo estudié. Yo estudié ingeniería en energías renovables, pero conforme fue pasando el tiempo me fui interesando más como por el área de programación y ciencia de datos y inteligencia artificial, ahorita que salió eso. Em, y bueno, tuve la oportunidad de trabajar en una empresa de inteligencia artificial por aproximadamente 2 años y medio y fue bastante interesante. Me dediqué como, bueno, mi papel era entrenar inteligencia artificial y era bastante padre, pero pues recientemente el proyecto terminó, ¿no? Y pues yo me vine a Japón para ver si pues podía entrar a una maestría y pues me puse a pensar que mientras estudiaba pues podía, justamente como les había comentado, pues grabarme y pues si llega a entrar alguien pues platicar con él cuando acaben esos 50 minutos de estudio, ¿no? Yo voy a intentar hacer esto diario y pues entre independientemente de alguien o no, también esto es un como ejercicio para mí, ¿saben? De hecho es más para mí, o sea, si al final del día como con gente o así está chido, pero me gustaría llevar una bitácora, o sea, me gustaría como de cierta forma llevar una bitácora y creo que de cierta manera el documentar tu vida te ayuda a tener un orden y verla en una perspectiva completamente diferente. Entonces me gustaría como documentar mi vida y esta es la parte en la cual yo documento pues mis estudios, ¿no? La forma en la que estudio y también de cierta forma como que me presiono un poco más a hacerlo. Yo vivo con mi novia aquí, en un departamento chiquito. En Japón son chiquitas los cuartos y pues sí, pues les estaré informando, yo lo seguiré haciendo. También de vez en cuando juegue me voy a grabar subiendo, pues, jugando, da igual. Realmente no creo que al inicio me dedique específicamente a algo y conforme vayan dando las cosas, pues como les menciono que realmente lo estoy haciendo como para documentarme a mí y llevar un cierto proceso creativo en las cosas, pues solo lo haré, ¿sabes? Como no. no me preguntaré mucho si está bien o no hecho. Y ya conforme vaya viendo cierto feedback de ustedes o de otra gente, pues iré como recalibrando. Entonces sí, ahorita específicamente no tengo planteado como tal algo en específico que quiera hacer. O sea, es como esa gente, te digo, o sea, que quiere hacer de todo, ¿no? Quiero hacer este análisis, quiero enseñarles un poco de Japón, de lo que yo he visto, de lo que me ha choqueado, lo que se me ha hecho completamente diferente, que he dicho, la madre. Y siento que muchas veces no lo hacía y me impedía hacerlo porque quería que fuera perfecto. Quería tener la edición más chingona, quería que todo fuera de la mejor manera posible. Y eso me empezó a detener en un buen de áreas de mi vida. Yo soy ingeniero y no hace mucho me titulé. De hecho, me titulé justamente antes de venirme de Japón. Y hay dos razones por las cuales yo me detuve, o sea, por la cual no me titulaba. La primera es que la carrera no me gustaba, entonces la pospuse mucho y cometí el error de pues no luchar o no hacer o estudiar lo que yo quería. Pero al final del día no soy una persona que me gusta dejar tirado absolutamente nada, entonces la terminé acabando, o sea, lo hice forzándome, la verdad. Y la segunda es que una parte de mí no quería hacerlo porque sabía que no lo iba a poder hacer de la manera perfecta en la que yo quería hacerlo, ¿saben? O sea, como no lo había empezado tan perfectamente como yo quería, ya que era como, de cierta forma, un desperdicio de tiempo acabar algo que no era perfecto para mí. Eh, y pues eso se traduce a todas las áreas de mi vida. Mucho tiempo, yo estuve grabando un podcast con un amigo y mucho tiempo siento que eso fue lo que me enseñó a que no debe ser perfecto y bueno, otras cosas en la vida, ¿no? Pero específicamente hablando de contenido y de subir contenido a redes sociales y así, como que quería como tener la cámara perfecta y yo no empecé a grabar ese podcast hasta que no compramos una cámara perfecta y de que me endeudé y compré micrófonos y luces y todo. Y en este caso, pues nada que ver, o sea, estoy en las condiciones, a comparación de cómo estaba en ese momento y todas las herramientas, ahorita no tengo ninguna herramienta para empezar a hacer esto, ¿sabes? Pero creo que la diferencia es que justamente no me esperé a que fuera perfecto y yo hice ese podcast hace como 2 años. O sea, ahorita llevo, am, sería mi primer video después de 2 años, fueron como 10 videos y bueno, estuvo muy chido, la verdad, aprendí muchas cosas. Pero mi punto es de que justamente me estaba esperando a que todo fuera perfecto. Y en este caso ya no. O sea, no quiero que sea perfecto, no espero que sea perfecto. Solo quiero hacerlo en todos los términos, ¿no? En estudiar, en subir contenido y todo. Entonces, pues no sé. Les iré enseñando mi proceso. El que no sea perfecto no significa que todo el tiempo voy a subir basura. Obviamente me voy a esforzar por cada vez subir cosas mejores, ir, pues como les digo, a prueba y error, ¿no? Si grabo un video, pues sí voy a ir viendo cómo modificar las luces, cómo hacer que se escuche mejor. No tengo ni idea de si esto se va a escuchar bien. Pero está padre porque, pues, o sea, no solo estoy yo aquí, sino de que puedo enseñarles cosas. Este es el contenido del canal, es cero. Mi canal se llama Edgar Domínguez, esa no es la mejor selección. O a lo mejor sí, de nombre, no sé, uno nunca lo sabe. Pero bueno, y esto no lo va absolutamente nadie, al menos lo voy a ver yo en 10 años. Y voy a ver si todo lo que dije que iba a hacer aquí lo cumplí, que es una maestría. Si no es una maestría, un trabajo, pero los dos tienen que ser en un país extranjero, preferiblemente Japón, que estás aquí. Me gustaría quedarte aquí. Em, si no se puede Japón, pues cualquier otro, pero intentar salir de mi país, México. Y pues hacer más contenido y en general hacerlo por ti. O sea, yo siento que algo de las cosas que más me apasiona es crear. Se oye bien, no sé, es un cliché, ¿no? Todo el mundo dice que le gusta crear, pero neta a mí me gusta crear cosas, o sea, me gusta estar involucrado en proyectos. Siento que se vuelven como tus hijos de cierta manera. Y es como bastante curioso porque así como un hijo puedes hacer algo muy mal y después ver cómo termina en la cárcel, o puedes hacer algo muy bien y después terminar viendo cómo se vuelve doctor. Creo que un proyecto es algo así. O sea, puedes empezar a observarlo y si haces las cosas bien, pues te puede salir algo chido y si haces las cosas mal, te puede salir algo mal. Pero al igual que un hijo, no siempre, aunque tú hagas las cosas bien, te va a salir bien, ¿no? Pero bueno, creo que estoy divagando un chingo. El punto es de que, pues sí, esta parte del canal va a ser para estudiar, va a haber vlogs, gameplay, no sé, incluso a veces subiré reflexiones yo solo hablando a la cámara. Pues en general, enseñar mi vida, compartir con ustedes y compartir con mi yo de 10 años. Voy a decir que esa es la meta. ¿Podría ser esta una cápsula de tiempo? Entonces, bueno, algo que también me gustaría mejorar en estos videos es el aura. Son dos cosas. La confianza. Me gustaría tener mucha más confianza. Eh, Siento que a veces soy una persona muy consciente de mí mismo. O sea, ah, con eso me refiero no que tenga mucha conciencia elevada o algo así, sino que todo el tiempo estoy como en mi cabeza eh, preguntándome qué pensará la gente de mí, ¿sabes? O qué estarán diciendo de mí, o cómo me estarán observando. eh, y es algo que ya no quiero sentir, ¿sabes? De cierta forma me gustaría poder hacer las cosas sin estar a la expectativa de lo que van a decir de mí. Em, y la segunda es mejorar el aura, la confianza en mí. Creo que la gente con confianza y que lo explaya y que lo siente y que se vuelve parte de su aura, eso es, no sé, una de las cosas que más aspiro a tener porque creo que también te vuelves de cierta forma un líder. Y bueno, o sea, me gustaría lo de líder porque también en un momento de mi vida me gustaría como formar una empresa. Pero sí, siento que estoy quedando como güey de las 10.000 cosas, el que mucho abarca, poco aprieta. Es como si pareciera que no tengo algo claro o definido. Podríamos decir que lo más claro definido que tengo es que quiero, quiero poder entrar a una maestría, quiero poder vivir en Japón, bueno, quedarme a vivir aquí, am, o poder conseguir un trabajo aquí. En dado caso de que no, pues bueno, o sea, ya estuve de vacaciones aquí un ratote, eh, pero sí. Ah, pero bueno, eh, creo que esto es muy buen ejercicio para mí, para introducirles más o menos quién soy, cómo soy. Obviamente con el tiempo espero ir mejorando. La verdad no planeé absolutamente nada, simplemente estoy hablando conforme va saliendo y como que siento que está bien porque quiero que me conozcan y quiero conocerlos. Pero también porque de cierta manera, si no planeé nada, sale más orgánico y ustedes me conocen y saben cómo realmente soy o intento ser y bueno, qué máscara quiero mostrarles. Tal vez no, tal vez es una máscara, pero bueno, sí. Am, qué más me gustaría mejorar con eso? Bueno, me gustaría mejorar cómo hablo. A veces divago mucho, me gustaría ser más concreto con mis ideas, que se entiendan mejor. Me cuesta muchísimo trabajo hacer que la gente me entienda. Eh, y bueno, en general me gustaría, como les dije, creo que ese es como el resumen de todo, crear. Me gustaría hacer videos que digas, hola, está muy chido, pero también me gustaría transmitir, ¿sabes? O sea, más allá de que digas, ah, qué chido se ve, que digas, que te transmita algo. em, y, y en general creo que crear y subir contenido te ayuda mucho en ese crecimiento, ¿no? En el que cómo te percibes. Y puede estar las dos partes, ¿no? Que la percepción de los demás te termina afectando. O puede estar la parte en la cual, como estás constantemente observándote, como que te des cuenta si tu percepción sobre ti es correcta o no y pues la vayas mejorando poco a poco. Entonces, sí, eso es todo. En este caso, yo tengo que estudiar al menos una hora. Entonces vamos a estudiar. Yo les pondré música. Mm, Solo que problema que tengo es que no sé qué música puedo poner, ¿sabes? O sea, de que obviamente no puedo poner cualquier tipo de música porque existe el copyright. Eh, mm, entonces tiene que ser música que... ok, esa es la música. Tiene que ser música que nos ayude a estudiar a los dos, tres, cuatro, a nadie, a nadie. Em, pero también tiene que ser música que nos guste, ¿no? Digamos, a la madre, estoy estudiando muy cabrón con esta rola. ¿Saben quién me gusta un chingo? Este güey. No me gustaba tanto, pero mi primo lo pone mucho. Si ves esto, chiquis, te amo. Lo pone mucho. Y hay una rola de este cabrón. Está muy buena. Este güey ya sabe de quién estoy hablando. Miren, ustedes la van a escuchar directamente. Yo me voy a poner los audífonos. Que si no se hace el efecto eco o Mandela. A ver, unos, uno, otro. Bluetooth. Nothing. Ahí está. Eh, de rolón. No la podemos escuchar todo. Copyright. Entonces, no, aquí no lo van a escuchar porque más complicado de lo que parece, ¿eh? Eso que dicen de que los streamers no saben hacer absolutamente nada, claro que sí saben. A ver si les gusta este güey, se me hace buenísimo. De la mera polla. Tendría que pagar YouTube Premium, ¿ustedes qué dicen? Ah, ya empezó, ¿no? Ahí sí ya tienen que escuchar de a huevo.
¿De qué va a hablar mi canción si se calma ese dolor que me da inspiración? ¿Hace cuánto dejé de ser ese pibe soñador encerrado en su habitación? Recuerdo mirar estrellas, pedirle a cada una de ellas que confíe en mi intuición. Pensar que el
Pero bueno, no les puedo poner esto para estudiar, ¿no? Vamos a cantar. Entonces, es... Escuchen esa sinfonía, bro. Mi parte favorita es cuando cae el rayo, el trueno, en ese instante, güey. Esa parte, güey, uff, trofa. Bueno, vamos a estudiar. No puedo seguir haciendo pendejo. Miren, eso es lo que yo voy a estudiar. No se los puedo enseñar porque tiene copyright. Esto es lo que yo voy a estudiar. Ustedes empiecen con lo que ustedes van a estudiar. Así que empezamos en... Empezamos en uno, dos, tres.
These brochures and then decide for yourself that it is worthwhile for you to actually show up and get the screening done. Okay, so lower socioeconomic status or education often resulted in actually women then not being able to show up for the screening just because they were at work all the time, for example, or just not wanting to show up for the screening. And so you have the people who got screened and the people who refused to get screening are actually, they're not randomized at all, right? They decided themselves whether they wanted to show up for the screening, or they decided that they didn't want to show up for the screening. And so you actually see that these are two very different populations. One of them has basically double the rate of dying due to any other disease. And so you can definitely not compare the 1.1 versus the 1.5 here. Okay, because this is not a randomized comparison. These two groups of people are extremely different from each other. In fact, you know, they have basically in the refused group, you have double the death rate than in the screened group. Okay, so so this one here is not a randomized comparison. Okay, so then let's move on. So then these two cannot be compared against each other, right? So now let's see whether we can compare anything else against each other. So we had like the comparison of 1.1 versus 2. Let's try this one here. So 1.1 versus 2 is actually very, very similar. Okay. So so this is 21 versus 28. So here, you know, it's very similar. If you would do a hypothesis test, they're actually again showing up to be quite different. So in the screened group, you actually have much less, much lower death rate than overall in the control group. Okay, so so again, we wouldn't want to compare these two groups against each other. Okay. So the only comparison that we can make here is in fact the 1.3 versus the 2. Okay, so the only comparison that we can make here that is a randomized control trial is comparing the 1.3 versus the 2.0. Okay. So here you see that the deaths due to all other causes are basically the same. This is not statistically significant. So this is just the same. And so all we can compare is 1.3 versus 2.0. Okay, so, and again, this is in fact what the people wanted to do a study on, right? So the study is whether offering mammography can reduce the number of deaths enough to matter, not whether taking a mammogram reduces the number of deaths enough to matter. And this is critical how you set up the question at the beginning, okay? So that because the policy that was being considered at the time is not to force women to take a mammogram every year, but to offer women to get a mammogram done. And so because the policy is to offer, not to force someone to get a mammogram done, what you want to study is whether offering to get a mammogram done reduces the number of deaths due to breast cancer. If the policy that was being considered was whether taking a mammogram reduces the number of deaths due to breast cancer, then the study should have been set up differently. Okay, in that setting, you would have done first an ethical board approval of, you know, if a woman decides to be part of the study, then they have to sign that they are okay with either getting a mammogram or not getting a mammogram. Okay, like when you're doing a drug trial, that's something that you have to sign that you will either get the placebo or you will actually get the drug. And you know, you are basically being forced to take whatever is given and you're signing that you're okay with that. And then you would have done, you know, a trial where you get the mammogram done and the other, and so in one setting, you have a placebo where there is no, you know, no radiation going through you. You have exactly the same type of the same procedure going on because it has to be double blind, right? So the person who is performing the study also doesn't know whether the radiation, whether there will be radiation or not. And so that's the setting where you can understand the question whether taking a mammogram reduces the number of deaths enough to matter. But here, the policy that was being considered is whether offering a mammogram reduces the number of deaths enough to matter, right? That's why this is the right study to set up. And so this is critical also when you're thinking about completely different applications, say in advertising. It's whether you are just, whether people who you have shown an online ad have, you know, changed their behavior in terms of like actually spending more on your website, or whether people who click on the ad that you have shown them spend more on your website. Those are exactly the same types of questions that we have now looked at here, right? Whether people who show up for screening or they refuse to get screening, you could think of them as the ones who actually click on the ad and the ones who don't click on the ad. And so you need to think through first, very carefully, what is the question that you're actually interested in looking at, okay? So the two numbers that we want to compare at here is 1.3 versus 2.0. Now, there was a really important comment before, and I do want to talk about it, that in fact, in the refused group, we look at here the refused group, we actually see that it's the number of deaths due to breast cancer is lower than in the control group. Okay. And so, so there, however, we know that the refused group is very, very different, right, than the control group, because these are individuals who have a lower social, as we said, right, these are individuals who have a lower socioeconomic standard than an average in the control group, which was just at random selected. So does anyone know what could explain this? What could explain in the group of with lower socioeconomic standards which is the refuse group, why they actually have a lower death rate due to breast cancer? Okay, so a suggestion is that they die due to other causes before cancer gets them. So in fact, this amount here is not significant enough to explain it in that way. So there is another reason for it. It's in fact something that is that in these individuals, they are protected. They have something that protects them from breast cancer. Does someone know what that is? So it's not genetics, because genetics is not correlated with socioeconomic status. Okay, Alfia puts in the right thing, and Dandara as well. It's actually childbearing. Okay, so childbearing, we know, is protective of breast cancer, so reduces the risk due to of dying due to breast cancer. And so individuals with a lower socioeconomic status also, in average, have more children, which is in fact protective of breast cancer. So that's what explains this reduced number here. Okay. And so that's something very interesting that you already find in this data set here that is known now by research. Okay, so but the numbers we want to compare is this 1.3 versus this 2.0. Okay. And so now let's go through actually how to compare these 1.3 versus 2.0. So here is just a summary of everything we've talked about until now. Okay. So as we said, it seems natural to compare those who accepted screening to those who refused screening. But this is an observational comparison. These two groups are not the same. Okay, so we set out to do a randomized control trial. Let's continue on with that and not just break up everything, right, that we so carefully designed and then suddenly do an observational comparison. And so this becomes clear when you compare the death rates from all other causes. And so instead, what we really need to compare is the numbers 1.3 versus 2.0. The study was put up very carefully because the question that was being asked here is whether offering mammography reduces the number of deaths due to breast cancer, not whether taking a mammogram reduces the number of deaths due to breast cancer. Okay, so it's known as an intention to treat analysis. So where we're analyzing whether just offering the treatment actually reduces the number of deaths due to breast cancer. Okay, so now how do we go about it, right? So we need to compare this 1.3 rate to this 2.0 rate. So it's lower, right? So 1.3 deaths out of 1,000 is, or 39 deaths out of 31,000 is much lower than 63 deaths out of 31,000, or a death rate of 2.0. So now the question is that significant, right? Or is it that maybe next time we perform the study, study again, then it comes out to be the opposite. It comes out that suddenly you have more deaths in the treatment group than in the control group. Okay, so is this difference actually significant enough? And do we believe that if we were to repeat the study, then again, we would get similar results out? That's what we need to answer now, right? Just having like two numbers come out and being like, oh, in this study, yes, this number, the death rate was lower in the treatment group than in the control group. That's not enough, right? Now, here is where statistics comes in, where we then need to say, hey, I really believe that, this number was not just by chance, but that it was significantly different, that, really something has changed in the treatment group as compared to the control. Okay, the death rate has in fact changed. And so in order to do this, we need to come up with a model of what we think, right? How we model the death rate in the control group, and then see whether, the number of deaths that we see in the treatment group, whether that is significantly, that the probability of seeing, 39 deaths in the treatment group instead of 63, how large is the probability of seeing so few deaths in there? Okay, so that's what we want to do now. So we need to come up with a model for the death rate, right? For how many individuals die out of 31,000 in the treatment group, in the control group, right? The status quo is like the model that we want to come up with. Well, we basically have two outcomes, right? Someone dies due to breast cancer, someone doesn't die due to breast cancer. So we just have two outcomes. So what is a good distribution to model these two outcomes? Out of 31,000. So binomial distribution, right? So that's a very standard one. So the control group, we would just have a binomial distribution where the expected rate is 63 deaths out of 31,000. So that's what you see here. That's this nice curve. It's just a binomial distribution. That's what you would, right? That's the null model. If you don't do anything, the death rates, this is what you expect it to be in the control distribution. Now, we got to see only 39 deaths due to breast cancer. So we're down here, right? So what is the probability of just seeing 39 deaths? That's tiny. Okay, so that's the probability under the curve here. So you can hardly see it. It's that little area there under the curve. And so any statistical or any program, any computer program can actually do this for you, whether it's R, so the more statistical ones, whether it's Python, whether it's MATLAB, etc. They can all compute p-values. So these are these probabilities of actually seeing these extreme values So what is the probability of just under this model seeing 39 deaths or fewer? That little area there is 0.0012. So the probability of just seeing 39 deaths, if nothing had changed, okay, if we were still in the same model as in the control group, so treatment wouldn't have changed anything, the probability of seeing just 39 deaths is tiny. It's like 0.0012. Okay, and so usually we would say if something has such a small probability, often like our cutoff is something like 0.05. Okay, if something happens with such a small probability, we would just not believe that this could have happened by chance. Of course it could, but with such a small probability that we would say, hey, I just believe that it wasn't by chance, but in fact, what better explains this is actually that something has changed, okay? That offering treatment, or in this case, offering mammography, really reduced the number of deaths. And so the curve, the distribution is just not the same anymore. And so in this case, we would reject the null hypothesis. Okay, so the control model is known as the null hypothesis. So that's just our status quo. And now we get data, which is the 39 deaths, and we see like, wow, the probability of seeing that is just so small. And so we would reject the null hypothesis. Okay. So that's how the hypothesis testing framework works. So it's really quite simple that you just first have to come up with a statistical model of the status quo. Okay, so that's the control group. So in this case, there are just two outcomes, right? Either someone, lives over the next 5 years, or someone dies due to breast cancer in these 5 years. And so that gives us the status quo distribution of dying due to breast cancer. And then we compare that to the number of deaths that we actually get to see. Okay, so the control group is known as the null hypothesis. Okay, and then you compare that to the treatment group, which is those 39 deaths, this blue point in there. Okay, and so if it's like really small probability, we would say this just couldn't have happened by chance. And so because it's smaller than 0.05, in this case, we would reject the null hypothesis and say that offering mammography really reduces the number of deaths significantly. And we do believe that that we should introduce mammography or offering mammography widely because it really reduces the number of deaths due to breast cancer. And that's in fact what was done. And so then this study was repeated just to be sure that it also works in other populations. It was repeated in other countries with the similar outcomes. And that's what then led to the widespread introduction of offering mammography around the world. Okay, so this is just an example to show you how critical it is that we ask the right question and then collect the right data. Okay. So I just want to, again, briefly say that, of course, exactly the same questions arise in all kinds of applications, right? As I mentioned at the beginning, I wanted to do a case study in a setting where it's about life and death, where it's really, really critical that you make the right decisions. But of course, in all kinds of other applications, it's you always, you'll find exactly the same questions. We already did the advertising example. Also, it's often called A/B testing in those settings, right? Where, you have to ask the question, really think through carefully about what you actually care about, whether it is showing an ad or someone clicking on the ad, say. But of course, also in any other business setting or say manufacturing setting, the same questions come up. You may want to introduce a new process. And now you need to really have a very carefully defined question. So you have the status quo, your old process, you have your new process. So you have a control group, right? And you have to have a very carefully defined question, like whether introducing the new process really reduces the number of defective products sufficiently to matter. And the financial setting, right, where you may be introducing a new instrument or new investment strategy. And you need to ask, again, a very careful strategy of comparing it to the status quo, whether it actually provides better returns than what you had before. Advertising, the question that we already had. Business, you need to make, you have maybe a new initiative that you may want to roll out. So again, compare it very carefully to what you had before. That would be your control group. And ask a very careful question. Maybe what you care about is growing your business, right? In a particular way, either it's number of customers or, amount of investments, etc. So ask the question very carefully and then do a hypothesis testing. So first select, actually collect the data that you need in order to answer it, and then do a very carefully performed hypothesis testing to analyze the data set that you're actually getting. Okay. So that was the whole strategy thought through in one very important application. Okay. So I will just, I'll take now here a 5-minute break so that we all have a little bit of time. Either you need to have a bio break, so you can, of course, everything is recorded, so don't worry about it. I'll still just continue taking, in this case, to take a binomial distribution. And so normal distribution, this is it. So in this case, it's to analyze the data set that you're actually getting. So that's... So don't worry about it. I'll still just continue taking questions, and everyone who wants to go off quickly get something to drink, you can just watch questions. So perfect. Thank you for everyone who is already answering questions in here to others of, like, for example, how do you compute the p-value? So there are all that there is the command in there. Also, we have code for computing it as well. So, but it's always even better if it's just one command. Okay. So it's just knowing what is the dense, how much is the mass under this curve here. So that's literally this little area here under the curve, and that can just be done with one command. Okay. So there are questions about, how do we decide on what is the distribution, or what is the null hypothesis in some sense, right? So in this case, so what is a null hypothesis? Always the status quo. That's what the null hypothesis is. So in this case, it's the control group, right? And so now we need to come up with a model, a statistical model for what, how many deaths do we expect to see in the control group? And so now here, because it's about number of deaths, there is only 2 outcomes. And so that's why it makes sense in this case to take a binomial distribution. Now, sometimes people say, well, I would have taken a normal distribution. So in this case, because you have so many individuals, like 31,000, it actually doesn't matter. You could also take as you see here, the curve looks like a normal distribution, because the binomial distribution at some point, approaches the normal distribution if you have a lot of individuals. However, right, the normal distribution also has some probability of being negative. And of course, you cannot have less than 0 deaths, right? So in this case, the binomial distribution just fits better than the normal distribution based on that particular application area. But, in this case, it wouldn't have made such a big difference. Okay, so stated the hypothesis. So maybe I go back to the hypothesis setting. Okay. So now I understand what the question might be. So there is the word that offering mammography reduces the risk of death from breast cancer. So the word offering mammography should probably be in here, and I think I agree. So maybe we would put in the word offering in here. But I always said it correctly, so maybe in here it should be written also clearly. So hopefully this is what the comment was. Okay, so another great question about about saying, so why we explained here the difference between the death rates in the refuse group versus the control group. We could have also, given it some blame of describing the difference between the 38 and 28, and that's totally right. I think that doesn't change the reasoning of why we need to look at the total treatment group versus the total control group, okay? Because that's really the only randomized control trial that we can do based on this data. So that's where randomization comes in. Everything else is based on choices of individuals. And so, an individual chooses to refuse the treatment or chooses to get screened, and therefore that is not a randomized trial anymore. Okay, so let me continue. Okay, so are there, so these are really important questions of like, are there longer term data sets, right? So now we also have questions of whether there are risks associated with the particular radiation, etc. So these are questions that come up. And of course, for some individuals, that is a risk. But for many individuals, the benefits outweigh the risks in this setting. So that's why, this type of radiation is only done, once or twice per year and not more often, and cannot be done more often because there are risks involved. But these are really important questions that, of course, then have to be studied again also with clinical trials as well, in terms of like how much radiation is too much and how much is actually okay. Okay. So then there are other questions about where, this generalizes. This totally generalizes to, settings where you want to offer a plan, a standard plan, or a plan that has additional initiatives in it, in tech support business. So really in any setting, I think you can come up with examples like this where you want to change the strategy that was there before. And so you should really collect very cleanly data from old strategy and new strategy, right? And really have that randomized individuals who get access to your tech support business with the new strategy, and the ones who get access to the old strategy, and then actually collect data very carefully in order to understand what the difference is and whether it's worth introducing the new strategy. Okay, good questions about people who have had quite a bit of hypothesis testing before already. So they're asking about two-sided test versus one-sided test. So here, as we're asking the question of whether introducing mammography reduces, or offering mammography reduces, the number of deaths due to breast cancers. It's clearly a one-sided strategy that I'm asking. I'm not asking about whether it changes the number of deaths due to breast cancer. I only care about whether it reduces the number of deaths due to breast cancer. That's why we did a one-sided test here. Okay, so again, another, this is really critical that we ask the question very carefully, right? To know whether it's a one-sided or a two-sided test. Okay, so, and I'll just maybe end with, people are already getting back, and we'll continue on, just end again with what the control model is here. So this is the status quo. So this is how many deaths we would expect to see if nothing had changed, right? If offering mammography didn't change anything, then in this case here, we would have a binomial distribution where the mean is at the observed number of deaths, just 63 out of 31,000. And so we have this binomial distribution around it. And so since we only saw 39 deaths, that event happens with a very, very small probability of 0.0012. And so, we will reject this control model or the null model, and instead, conclude that in fact offering mammography has changed the distribution. It has changed the model, and in fact we have now less deaths than in the control model, so in the null hypothesis. Okay, so we went very carefully through one important case study, right, of like showing you how critical it is to ask a very careful question. Think through what is it that you actually care about. In this case, offering mammography. The policy is offering mammography, not taking a mammogram, and then setting up the study so that we can actually answer that question. And we also went through the hypothesis testing framework. Okay. So you can apply it in all your different types of applications, exactly this setting. Okay, always ask a careful question, collect the data, and to answer that question, and then go through the hypothesis testing framework that we just did. Be it in finance, be it in business, be it in advertising, etc. In all these settings, right, you will have exactly the same questions. Now, this course is all about, teaching you what are things that you have to be. So first of all, like when you have a particular application, how to think about it, but then also what do you have to be careful about when you're going through these settings. And now that's what I want to do here in the hypothesis. exciting. Okay, there is something that we really have to be careful about. So I want to show this to you with another case study here. Okay, so this is a really, very well-performed study, okay? Very well-performed study about prostate cancer and food items that may reduce the risk of prostate cancer, okay? So with hundreds of different food items were tested here. As I said, it was very carefully performed, so nothing is wrong in the study itself. A lot of individuals participated, so sample size is large, etc. The results were that intake of tomato sauce reduces the risk of prostate cancer significantly, right? A p-value of 0.001. Tomatoes as well, pizza as well. So that's exciting, right? And then this suggests that maybe it is, anything that has to do with tomato. But they tested, a lot of different food items, okay? And then here we get tomato juice is not significant. Then we're like, well, maybe it's just vegetables or something. Well, spinach is also not significant. Many other vegetables are also not significant. Okay, so what is going on here? So is it really that pizza that we should go away from this? So exactly as Joshua just puts it, should we go away from this and say like, oh, we should all eat more pizza and really pizza reduces the risk of prostate cancer? Or what could be the explanation for these types of results, these types of p-values that we find here? Okay. Okay, Matteo exactly puts in what is happening. Okay, so here actually nothing is wrong with the study. It's just something that we really have to be careful about. Let me explain this on a particular example, maybe here, of a wonder pill. So say I know that I have a pill that just has a drop of water in it, so there's nothing in it, okay? So I know it has no effect whatsoever. And let's say I take 1,000 people, so pretty large cohort, and I measure 100 variables before and after taking the pill. So weight, blood pressure, etc. Just 100, glucose level, blah, blah, okay? And now you perform a hypothesis test with significance level of 5%. Well, how many tests do you think will actually end up positive, so significant? How many p-values will be smaller than 0.05? So it's exactly 5%. Okay, so in fact, if we do 100 different tests and we have a significance level, so a cutoff value in it. Okay, so I know it has no effect whatsoever. And let's say I take 1,000 people, so pretty large cohort, and I measure 100 variables before and after taking the pill. So weight, blood pressure, etc. Just 100, glucose level, blah, blah, okay? And now you perform a hypothesis test with significance level of 5%. Well, how many tests do you think will actually end up positive, so significant? How many p-values will be smaller than 0.05? So it's exactly 5%. Okay, so in fact, if we do 100 different tests and we have a significance level, so a cutoff value of 5%, well, we should expect that 5% of the tests get a p-value that is smaller than 5%. Because significance level, that's exactly what it means. Okay, when we did here a cutoff of 5%, if I go back to where we had this, so this was, if we do a cutoff at 5%, we say we already know that 5% of the times we will make a mistake. We just say that we're okay with events that only happen at 5% chance. We are going to decide that that is such a small probability that we're fine with making a mistake, and we will just decide that they're significant. Okay, that's what this cutoff means. So we have to be really aware of this, that, in this case, we had a p-value of 0.0012. That's a small probability, but it is still a probability that, in fact, this event just happened by chance. It could be that, offering the mammography just didn't change anything, and we just by chance get such a small event, such a small death rate of, 39 deaths in this case. That has a probability, it just has a very small probability of 0.0012. And we just decided that anything that is smaller than a 5% probability, we're just going to reject the null hypothesis. But we have to be clear that, if we do hundreds or thousands of hypothesis tests, well, and we always say that anything that comes out with a p-value that's smaller than 5%, we're just going to reject it. Well, we will see 5% of tests that we're just going to reject just by chance. Okay, so if you set your p-value to 6% as is just put in, well, then you have to be okay with making a mistake 6% of the time. Okay, so that's how this should be read. And so, you know, whenever you see statements like red cars of this make and that year are less likely to get into an accident, that's when your alarm bells should go up, because this means that people have done so many hypothesis tests, right? They have checked all types of colors, they have checked all kinds of makes of cars, they have checked all kinds of years, they have done so many tests. And, you know, maybe you have seen this little cartoon here, right? Where, okay, jelly beans, if you look at, you know, if you look at purple jelly beans, they don't cause acne. If you look at brown jelly beans, they don't cause acne. If you look at blue jelly beans, again, not significant. If you look at yellow jelly beans, again, not significant. But then, hey, if you look at green jelly beans, then it comes out to be significant. Okay, so this is the issue, right? And this is just something with us understanding what hypothesis testing means and what a significance level of 5% means. 5% means we're okay 5% of the time making a mistake. And so if you do 100 tests, well, then 5% of them will just come out to be significant when they shouldn't be significant, just because of how we chose the cutoff. Okay? So that's critical, right? So if I go back to this example that we had here, well, here they actually tested hundreds of food items, literally hundreds of food items. And so, you know, we shouldn't be surprised that some of them come out to be, you know, in some sense significant, right? If you choose 100 of them, then you should expect that 5 of them just come out to be significant, although they aren't, right? This is just a false positive result. Okay. So that's what this means. So if you from here conclude that really eating pizza reduces the risk of prostate cancer, well, that's, you know, a false conclusion. It's known as a false positive in this case. And it just has to do with doing 100 tests, and then, you know, you should expect that 5 of them come out to be significant. Now, this is an issue more generally, right? So whenever you're thinking about hypothesis testing, even if you do it just once, you need to be aware of that, you know, there is a chance of making a mistake. In particular, you know, if you choose your cutoff to be 1%, then if over the years you do 100 hypothesis tests, you should expect that 1 of them comes back to be significant, although it shouldn't. Okay. And this isn't even p-hacking. It just has to do with, you know, what it means to do hypothesis tests. Okay, in this case, they really wanted to understand all of these different vegetables and these different food items, and so in here, right, we just get all these p-values back. It's about how do we read these p-values. Here, they really reported all of the tests they did, whereas in many settings, they wouldn't report the tests they did. There, it's p-hacking. Here, it isn't. Here, it's a really carefully performed study where they actually report all of the different tests that they did. Okay. So the question about sample size wouldn't help, right? This really has to do something with the hypothesis testing framework itself. If we choose a cutoff of 5% or a cutoff of 1%, it means that we're okay 1% of the time or 5% of the time making a mistake. So, as Mehdi puts it in, well, maybe what we should do, if we already know that we're going to do many, many hypothesis tests, maybe the cutoff of 5% is just not a good one, okay? And in fact, that's what we do, okay? So we will adjust the cutoff depending on how many tests you're going to perform. And so let's look through that and see how do we actually do that, okay? So now, again, it depends on the place where you're working at. So if you're in the FDA, then, you know, the Food and Drug Administration, they have to be super stringent, right? They need to be very, very sure that basically there are not going to be any false positives, right? If they let a food item or a drug be approved, it should be because that drug really helps health and not just for a false positive reason. However, if you're in another industry where you're just developing hypotheses, like say, you know, this is the first study you're doing, I work in genetics. I want to come up with hypotheses. I have like have like thousands of hypotheses I need to check. Then I don't care so much about false positives because I'm anyways going to do follow-up tests. Then I'm okay with being less stringent. Okay. So if you have to be super stringent, then what people use, like the FDA, is a family-wise error, meaning, you know, you really cannot do any, you really don't want to make, among all of your hypothesis tests, I don't want you to allow you to make many mistakes. So at least, you know, the probability of at least one false significant result has to be very, very small. Okay, so if go here, you know, the FDA does their standards, their regulations is they require you when you're doing your hypothesis framework setting to have a family-wise error rate of smaller than 5%. Okay, so over all tests that you're performing, if you're taking all of them together, you cannot have a more than 5% error rate. Whereas the FDR is a much less stringent, if I go back, so that's the false discovery rate. So the false discovery rate is just if I'm only looking at the tests that actually came back to be significant. Among these, I can do at most, say, a 10% error rate. So that's what all of us that are not FDA would usually use. We're usually okay with making a few more mistakes. So we would use the false discovery rate guarantee. Okay, but still, this is more stringent than just saying, you know, oh, do a cutoff at 5% for every one of the tests that you're doing. Now, of course, the question is, how do we get to these guarantees? Okay, so now here comes the math. And, you know, in this course, so as I put here, math is optional. In this course, what we want you to know is what you have to be careful about and, you know, what are some ways of actually dealing with it. So what are algorithms that will solve the problem for you, and then that you can just input. So for example, in Python, you can choose Bonferroni correction, you can choose Holm-Bonferroni correction or Beniamini-Hofberg correction. Okay, so you don't need to know how to implement it, but you need to know that there is an issue with performing many hypothesis tests and that we should correct for it. So we should change the cutoff, and these corrections all do it, in order to either protect yourself for the false discovery rate guarantee or with a family-wise error guarantee. Okay, and so Bonferroni correction, this is the most used one, although I would not use it. I'll tell you always that, you know, there is a newer version, and it's the Holm-Bonferroni correction, which has more power. But the Bonferroni correction is just so simple, and that's maybe the reason why people are still using it, although, you know, you're anyways going to do it via, you're anyways having your computer do it, so there's no reason to choose a simpler thing to do than a slightly more complicated one if anyways your computer is doing it. So you should definitely always use the Holm-Bonferroni correction. But just in terms of the intuition, it's very easy. The Bonferroni correction, all it does is if before you had a 5% cutoff, now you would have, and you do 100 tests, now instead of a 5% cutoff, you would do a 5% divided by 100 cutoff. Okay, so you would actually just adjust your cutoff by the number of tests to have, and you do 100 tests. Now, instead of a 5% cutoff, you would do a 5% divided by 100 cutoff. Okay, so you would actually just adjust your cutoff by the number of tests you do. That will give you family-wise error guarantee. Okay, so that's how we would correct for, like, you know, not making so many. But again, as I said, you know, instead of Bonferroni correction, yes, it's very easy mathematically, but use the Holm-Bonferroni correction because it's more powerful. And if you're fine with false discovery rate guarantee, then there is Beniamini-Hofberg correction. Again, you don't have to know how it works, but just know that whenever you are in the setting where you need to do a lot of hypothesis tests, so say you do your A/B testing in business, you have many different strategies that you want to compare against each other. It's critical that you correct for doing a lot of tests. Okay, so if you're not the FDA, you can just use Beniamini-Hofberg correction. if you have to be very, very sure about your decision of, like, you know, if you get a significant result, you want to be pretty sure that that is actually significant, you would use Holm-Bonferroni. So that's how you would choose. Okay. So all of them are going to make a change in terms of the cutoff of the p-values, and they will decide that, you know, some of the tests that you performed are actually not significant. And if we go back to the pizza example, in fact, if you do like even the Bonferroni correction, right, and you would divide by 100 your cutoff, your previous cutoff, so none of these would actually come out to be significant. Okay, so you would have been completely fine with just changing the cutoff, because taking into account that you're actually doing a lot of different tests. Okay, so so that's how this works. So something to be very careful about. Okay, so whenever you see statements about you know, this where it is clear, like, oh, I think of the jelly bean example. They, you know, green jelly beans are fine, yellow jelly beans are fine, purple jelly beans are fine, etc. Oh, red jelly beans are significant. That's when alarm bells should ring in your head whenever you see statements like this in the newspaper. Okay. So let's be very, very careful about these types of statements. And, you know, this is just a risk when you're doing a lot of hypothesis tests. Well, we need to have a cutoff, and, you know, the cutoff means that we're okay with making some mistakes. But we have to be careful when we're, of course, doing a lot of tests, because then mistakes will happen more often. Okay, and so the correction is based on the number of tests you're performing. Exactly. Okay. Okay, so that's something to be careful about in the hypothesis testing framework. Okay, so so now what we're going to do, so that was all the, you know, the setting where you are involved in collecting a large data set, the question that is being asked, and then the hypothesis testing framework to really analyze it. Now, you know, most of the course and all of the remainder of the course is about analyzing data, right? So now we will switch over to analyzing data. So from collecting data to actually analyzing data. And we'll use the remainder of this lecture to think about, well, what is the first thing you do when you actually get a large data set, right? How do you go about analyzing a large data set? What is the first thing you would do? I give you a huge data set, well, and now what, right? And so one of the first things we always do is actually look at the data. So we need to be able to visualize it. And so here is an example, again, from the kinds of things I do. But of course, always think of, you know, any of the applications you work on where we have a large tabular data set. So my rows are cells. So actually, you know, human cells. So like in this picture that you see here, so each one of these, you have like even like nice colors around them. Each one of these is a cell in our body. So every one of the rows would be cells, and every one of the columns would be features among these cells. So how round are they? What is the texture of these features? How large are they, etc. So these would be all of the covariates or variables that I'm measuring. So I have thousands of cells and thousands of different features that I'm measuring. Now, same thing, right? We talked about financial data. You have stocks, and you have all of the features are the prices at different days or different times. Or you have your customer base, right? All of the rows would be all of the different customers, and then the columns would be anything you're measuring about these customers, right? These are these large-scale data sets that you may have access to, that you work with every day. And so now, you know, you're getting one of these large-scale data sets, and so you need to know what are some of the first things that you would do in this large data set. And so the first thing I always do is to visualize the data. Okay, so I need to somehow be able to, yes, it's a big, big matrix of like, say, thousands of rows and thousands of columns, but I need to be able to visualize it in some way to know what am I looking at and to get a first impression of the data that I'm actually having access to. Now, we humans, right, we only see in 2 or 3 dimensions. So we need to be able to represent this high dimensional data into just 2 dimensions or 3 dimensions maximally, but usually we represent it in 2 dimensions. Okay, so so say you have, and let's not worry about you know, about notation here. Just always think of, you know, you have your large scale data set, okay, where you have n individuals, and they're all measured with 100 different variables. So he is 100. And now you would like to represent it in a very small dimensional space. So instead of 100-dimensional space where all my customers live in, I would like to represent it just in 2-dimensional space. So I would like to represent it just in 2-dimensional space. And so we'll talk about different ways of doing that. And in fact, we'll talk about just 2 representative ways of doing it. So one linear way of doing it and one non-linear visualization tool. Okay. Now, the linear visualization tool, probably many of you have used it, have heard of it. That's principal component analysis that we'll talk about here, or PCA for short. Okay. And then we'll compare that to a non-linear visualization tool. That's stochastic neighbor embedding. There are other ones like UMAP, etc. So we'll talk about stochastic neighbor embedding. And so these are just examples of the linear world and the non-linear world. And you'll see, and we can talk about, what are the advantages and disadvantages of taking either a non-linear example like stochastic neighbor embedding or a linear method like principal component analysis. Okay, now in data analysis, you will see this often. There is no free lunch. So you can do a better method, so better in many different ways, but it costs you something, and usually it costs you in terms of computation time. Okay, so if you go to the non-linear versions, you will see we will get a lot of advantages as compared to just PCA. However, we will always pay a price, and this price will be in terms of computation time. Okay, so always remember there's no free lunch in data analysis. So whenever you get something better, usually you pay a price, and the price is in terms of computation time, memory, etc. So so that's how this works. So let's talk about first PCA and then the nonlinear method. Okay, stochastic neighbor embedding. So PCA, what is so many of you I'm sure have used it, so what is the intuition behind PCA? Well, the intuition behind PCA is, say you have, your customer base of 1,000 customers living in where you're measuring 100 different variables. So all of these 1,000 customers, they live in a 100-dimensional space. So now you would like to represent them in 2 dimensions. Okay. And so the thinking is the following, that, well, we would like to find the 2 dimensions where these customers are really different from each other. Because say one of your variables is where they live and the postal code is the same for all individuals, well, that's not a very interesting variable, right? Because all the individuals are the same in that variable. So probably that's not a good one to visualize because everyone is going to be on top of each other. And usually what you want to identify in these visualizations is maybe some clusters, right? Maybe these individuals are more similar to these individuals and that individuals. So you want to actually have the data as spread out as possible so that you can identify structure within the data, not as clustered as possible. And so that's exactly the intuition behind principal component analysis. It tries to find the 2 dimensions in which the data is as spread out as possible. Okay, that's all that principal component analysis tries to do. And so let me actually show you an example where this works. Represent them in 2 dimensions. Okay, and so the thinking is, etc. So we'll talk about stochastic neighbor embedding. And so these are just examples of the linear world and the non-linear world. And you'll see, and we can talk about, what are the advantages and disadvantages of taking either a non-linear example like stochastic neighbor embedding or a linear method like principal component analysis. Okay, now in data analysis, you will see this often. There is no free lunch. So you can do a better method, so better in many different ways, but it costs you something, and usually it costs you in terms of computation time. Okay, so if you go to the non-linear versions, you will see we will get a lot of advantages as compared to just PCA. However, we will always pay a price, and this price will be in terms of computation time. Okay, so always remember there's no free lunch in data analysis. So whenever you get something better, usually you pay a price, and the price is in terms of computation time, memory, etc. So so that's how this works. So let's talk about first PCA and then the nonlinear method. Okay, stochastic neighbor embedding. So PCA, what is so many of you I'm sure have used it, so what is the intuition behind PCA? Well, the intuition behind PCA is, say you have, your customer base of 1,000 customers living in where you're measuring 100 different variables. So all of these 1,000 customers, they live in a 100-dimensional space. So now you would like to represent them in 2 dimensions. Okay. And so the thinking is the following, that, well, we would like to find the two dimensions where these customers are really different from each other. Because say one of your variables is where they live, and the postal code is the same for all individuals, well, that's not a very interesting variable, right? Because all the individuals are the same in that variable. So probably that's not a good one to visualize, because everyone is going to be on top of each other. And usually what you want to identify in these visualizations is maybe some clusters, right? Maybe these individuals are more similar to these individuals and that individuals. So you want to actually have the data as spread out as possible so that you can identify structure within the data, not as clustered as possible. And so that's exactly the intuition behind principal component analysis. It tries to find the two dimensions in which the data is as spread out as possible. Okay, that's all that principal component analysis tries to do. And so let me actually show you an example where this works amazingly well, just to show you the power of PCA, although it's such a simple method. So here what we're taking is genetics data. Okay, so maybe many of you know 23andMe, for example, where they're collecting, like the data, genetics data of many, many individuals. And so every person lives in a million dimensional space. So this is like, you're collecting the data of, so, our DNA has A, C, G's, and T's. Okay, there are only 4 letters in our DNA, and it's, millions of these letters. And then most individuals, you and me, are the same in most of these letters, right? That's what makes us humans and different from an elephant, say. But there are particular positions, and there are still millions of these positions, where, there can be differences between different people, which tells you about their hair color, eye color, etc., height, etc., right? And so that's what we're here collecting, is all this data where actually individuals can be different from each other. So that's a string of 1 million A, C, G's, or T's. And all that was done here is to go from that 1 million dimensional space to 2 dimensions is just principal component analysis. Okay, so figure out the dimensions in which individuals vary the most, and then plot it. And so here you see a plot into these 2 dimensions. Okay, so every individual, think about it again, as a 1 million dimensional space, got plotted into this 2-dimensional space. And what you see here is amazing what came out. Okay, we don't know, so we didn't put into the data set anywhere where this person is from. However, if you just do principal component analysis, it seems like, so here, data from individuals from Europe was taken. It seems like every individual basically landed on the spot where the person was from. Okay, where you see, people from Spain and Portugal here, and then comes France, Switzerland, Belgium, Denmark, etc., Austria, Hungary, Czech Republic, etc., right? Greece down here, Italy, Slovakia is a little bit off, right? Cyprus, Turkey. So you see basically the map of Europe ended up is what you got here, which is really amazing, right? The PCA was able to do this. Okay, so this is how the power of principal component analysis for some applications. Okay, so now how does principal component analysis work? So hopefully, many of you have used it. So what it tries to do, as I said, is it tries to spread out the data as much as possible, right? So we have the first principal component is the direction in which the data has the biggest spread. Then the second principal component is orthogonal to that, but has the second biggest spread, etc., etc. So that's how the principal component works. Okay. And so now if, I can also think about it as not, the directions. And so that's how the principal component works. Okay. And so now if, I can also think about it as not, the directions in which there is the biggest spread, but in fact, the directions in which I'm losing the least information. Okay, so say we had like our 1 million dimensional data set, right? That we had for this genetics example. And so now we're thinking about, well, which dimensions can I remove without losing too much of the data? And so that's another way of thinking about principal component analysis. Like, okay, I can remove, the ones where there is not so much spread, like the variable where, where all individuals are the same. Well, you don't really lose a lot of information by just removing that one. Okay. So that's how you would choose which directions to leave out. And in fact, it turns out that that's the same. So whether you think about, so PCA does both, So you can think about, keeping the directions where there is the biggest variation in the data set, or throwing out the dimensions in which, the amount of information that you're throwing out is just the smallest. Both of this works, and they both give rise to the same representation in the end. Okay. And so that's how the intuition is, and I'll talk about how do you actually get to the principal components on the next slide. Maybe let me just answer one question here for PCA. So and that has to do with how we compute it. Principal component analysis does not rely on a random seed. Okay, so it's a deterministic computation, and so it will always come out the same way. So even if you run PCA again on this data set, you will find exactly the same math.